screwed with my channel. Test sound to make sure that we have sound going. Make sure that we have sound going. All right, that's great. So we have sound. Half the time people mess with the speaker. I don't know why they do that, but they do, which is highly annoying. We'll switch that. Actually, let's switch that back to there. Minimize that. Okay. This over here and go back. All right, so today I assigned a book called a rule book for arguments. You should have that. You can get it very cheaply for like $1 or so on Amazon. It's not expensive. It's a very pithy little book. A lot of what we do in this class is make arguments about things, and a lot of what we do as marketers is to make arguments. There's an apocryphal story about W.C. Fields. You all don't know who W.C. Fields is, do you? Never heard of him. He was an old-time comedian. He died, long before I was an adult or even a child. I think he died in the early 50s, I think. And he was kind of a large, fat man who his shtick was kind of about being an amiable drunk. And there's a apocryphal story about W.C. Fields stumbling out of the Brown Derby, which was a very famous restaurant in Los Angeles. And a woman on the sidewalk said, "Mr. Fields, you're drunk." And he replied with, "Yes, madam, and you're ugly, but in the morning I'll be sober." Implying that, drunkenness was a temporary condition, ugly was forever. And I imagine that led to some heated exchange. Is that an argument? Not really. Why?
Well, it is argument.
It is an argument?
Yeah, because his argument is she's ugly. Argument.
Okay.
I think it is.
You don't think it is?
I think there's two statements.
You think it's just a statement? I think that's correct. I think, here you go. Heads up. Catch a duck. I think that's correct. It's just statements of opinion. It's not necessarily an argument. Students tell me all the time in this class, I just don't like to argue, because they think that arguing is about fighting, about saying you're ugly and then having somebody reply back and it going on and there being no point to it. And it's not an argument because it's either a statement of fact, he's either drunk, which he admits, and she's either unattractive or not. That's not an argument, right? It's just a position. So what is an argument? And why are arguments fundamental to marketing? Well, arguments technically are not about fighting. They are about persuading. So they're about persuading our consumers or our constituents or our interlocutors that we should accept a proposition, that we should accept our position on something. So we make these all the time. Advertisements and marketing are inherently about an argument. You're trying to persuade the consumer that you want them to purchase your product, your good or service. So we see them used all the time. Now, a lot of them are done poorly. A lot of advertisements, and we will talk about in this class what makes an ad great, and we'll watch ads towards the end of the semester and see whether or not they're making good arguments. And a lot of times we don't make good arguments. There was a presidential debate. I used to teach political marketing before we saturated the marketing degree with so much substantive information that basically there's not a lot of free electives anymore. It used to be a much more loosely structured degree program, and you had a lot more choice in terms of the electives that you would take. And so I offered political marketing. It was a very popular course. I got students from the political science department that would enroll in the course along with marketers. And so I really liked teaching that course. And last week, there was the first Republican presidential debate on stage. And the candidates all presented ideas as to why the Republican electorate should choose them. I don't know that any of them were terribly effective in that. And the candidate who was leading in the polls didn't even bother to show up for the debate. And I'm not sure that that wasn't a wise decision on his part. I mean, when you've got a huge plurality of the vote, all you're going to do by showing up to that debate is lend legitimacy to the people that are on the stage. And so from a political standpoint, I'm not sure that that was an unwise decision. From a citizen standpoint, to not hear the substantive differences that separate our candidates is pretty bad. But even when they do show up, and Donald Trump showed up to a lot of debates when he first ran for president, the arguments that were made were not necessarily good arguments, because to make good arguments, it requires sometimes more than a 30-second soundbite. And so I find that people make arguments all the time. They don't necessarily make good arguments. In this class, what we want to focus on, though, because we're going to think about a lot of these issues deeply, like what is justice and what does justice have to do with marketing, which is the critical thinking challenge that I'll give you at the end of class, and I'll give you some time at the end of class to work on that in your groups. And there's a Dropbox on D2L that I'll show you where you're going to turn that in, and I'll give you some time at the beginning of next week to also finish that up. And then we'll talk about the theories that support these ideas and arguments about justice. So it's about persuading people to accept our position, not necessarily about fighting. Fighting is there can be arguments that are made in fights. They're generally not necessarily good arguments, right? So it's about trying to persuade people to accept our position and how we should go about doing that. So what are some of the rules? The first rule of argumentation, and this talks about this in the rule book for argument handbook, which is a good guide. So as we go through the semester, you should refer back to the book as we make arguments. For example, this first argument position that you and your groups are going to take is, what is justice and what does it have to do with marketing? So you're going to make an argument as to what you think justice is, and then give me examples of how justice applies based on your definition of the term. So first thing that we have to think about is the structure of the arguments that we're making. A lot of the arguments that we will make in this class will be deductive arguments. So using logic. So let me start with this question. Is marketing an art or a science?
Science in both.
You think it's what?
I think it's both.
You think it's both. Why do you think it's both?
I think you've got to find the anatomy behind persuading humans,
Okay.
the brains behind it, and then perfect it with art to make it more appealing and more effective.
Okay, so you think we can study consumers. This is your argument, is that we can study consumers and figure out what it is that they want, and then making that appeal attractive to them is an art.
Yes.
Is that, I don't want to put
Yep.
arguments in your mouth. Okay, so I think that's pretty good. You were shaking your head.
Yeah, I would say
man.
it's a science, but I
You
think
think
the
it's a
video, being able to create a video, that would be necessarily an art, in my opinion.
Okay,
like a video ad or,
So isn't that what he said? That it's a science, but then creating the
but
appeal?
the art was saying, he was like, the psychology part was saying the art.
Okay, so you think
Feeling.
that, by the way, marketing as a discipline emerges from two foundational disciplines. One is psychology and the other is economics. I make merciless fun of both of those foundational disciplines because psychology is the closest thing to witchcraft that we teach on a college campus. Lay on the couch and tell me your innermost thoughts and I woo, right? I mean, no, let's not do that. So, but psychology thinks that they're a science, right? I mean, they think that they're a science in figuring out, and consumer behavior is predicated on psychology. How do we figure out what it is that people want? And then producing the video, which is I think what he was saying as well, is the artistic part of it. Right? So there is an art and a science, and I think that's the correct answer, is that marketing is both an art and a science. Now, is everything that we teach on a college campus either an art or a science?
Not necessarily.
So what are the colleges here on campus? We have the College of Math and Science, we have the College of Liberal Arts, we have the College of Fine Arts and Design, we have the College of Business and the College of Education. Is business a science or is it an art? You've said that it's both, or marketing at least is. Marketing is the liberal arts of the business college. This is the part that is more, creative in many aspects than other parts of business. So is everything either an art or a science, or is there some third category?
I think a third category could be argued for somewhere between, or not between, but a mix of both.
Okay, so a combination of the two.
For example, like art and design, of course, it's gonna be like an art-based thing. It takes a lot of creativity, but as far as design goes, you can use math and geometry and all kinds of things that make it more
Okay.
scientifically.
So
Processes can be used.
one of the things I listened to this last summer was a lecture by the Grisham Chair in Geometry, which is what they call the chair at that college in mathematics. And he presented a lecture on the mathematics of art. And part of that lecture, he talked about, for example, wallpaper patterns. There are only something like 13 possible wallpaper pattern combinations, mathematically speaking. All wallpaper patterns are combinations of. Now you can have different colors and different designs, like features within those patterns, but the patterns themselves are mathematically, there's a limited subset of wallpaper designs. You can have chevrons, for example, you can have crossings. So it's very much a science or a mathematical formula to figure that out. We know from the mathematics of music that we can predict pretty accurately based on certain chords and rhythms what's going to be a popular song. Even songs that make no sense that become popular. I mean, what was the Jonas Brother who did the Cake by the Ocean song? Anybody listen to the lyrics of that song when it was popular? It no sense, made no sense whatsoever. But the beat behind it is a fairly, a mathematically, common repetition. So is there a third category? I think there is. So it's called pure logic. And mathematics is the language of science, but you can get mathematical proofs that have no basis in reality. They are logically consistent games, but they're not necessarily reflective of anything that occurs in the known world that we have, in the known universe. But they are mathematically and logically consistent. So I think there's a third category, which is pure logic. And what we're attempting to do in here is talk about not necessarily a science, but a logical way of thinking about ethics, because not everything is going to be able to be reduced to quantifiable numbers. Some of it may be reduced to quantifiable numbers, but not everything that we talk about in terms of ethics is going to be able to be reduced. We're going to have to use what Kant calls the mind's eye to see some of this. And we're looking for logically consistent positions that allow us to ascertain a priori what is, according to Kant, ethical or not ethical. So a priori knowledge is knowledge that is gained or derived from rational thought as opposed to a posteriori knowledge, which is knowledge that we have to gain through experience. What is knowledge that we have to gain through experience? Almost everybody in here, I'd be willing to bet, at some point in their life, learned to ride a bicycle. Right? Anybody in here not learned to ride a bicycle? Kind of amazed. Sometimes I do find students from time to time, as we've become a society that no longer goes outside because we have our entire universe right in front of us in the palm of our hand, that lots of students just are not at all interested in going outside and engaging with the world. And why would you want to do that? You can play, what is the latest game on your phone that's popular? Angry Birds. That's rather an old game now, isn't it?
10 plus years old now.
What is it?
I said that's probably like 10 plus years old now.
That's 10 plus years old.
I just hit level 8,000 on Candy Crush, so.
Candy Crush, so that's still popular. I thought that one had,
No, it's
Sort
not.
of- sort
I'm
of-
the only one I know.
you're the only one that plays it.
My mom plays that religiously.
I actually still play Candy Crush. It's kind of entertaining when you've just got nothing else to do. I guess there are some limitations to the phone. You can't really get the super graphics. My nephew plays all these video games that, you know, I can't keep up with what the latest one is. I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, I went to my brother's house and he was playing Fortnite. And I went back 2 weeks later and I said, "Hey Carson, you want to play Fortnite?" He's like, "Oh, that is so like last week. I don't know what they're playing now." But why would you want to go outside when you have all of this entertainment right there, you know, in an air conditioned, particularly in this state, and they live in Texas. It's hot, it's miserable outside. It's actually kind of nice today, but it's been hot and miserable. So they're, you know, sitting there playing these games. Why would we want to, you know, ride a bicycle when we can do that? My point is that when you first learn to ride a bicycle, for everybody who's done it, you're not good at it. You don't know how to do it intuitively. It's not something that you just see in the mind's eye and understand. It's about feeling the balance and the momentum of the machine. And you know, you fall down a lot. They put training wheels. My parents didn't. My parents were sort of cruel. We didn't have training wheels. It was, you know, like the more you fall down, the more faster you'll learn to ride the bike. So there were no training wheels for us. We learned fairly quickly how to ride the bike. But you know, you put training wheels on, then take the training wheels off. You get the feel of how to do this. But it's not intuitive. There is knowledge that you can gain just by thinking about it. So if we take, for example, a rectilinear triangle, a right angle triangle, and we say that this side is 3 and this side is 4, we know that the third side has to be 5, right? How do we know that? That's called the Pythagorean theorem. A squared plus b squared equals c squared, right? Did Pythagoras go around in ancient Greece drawing triangles in the dirt and measuring them and figure this out. No, you can see this with the mind's eye. And this is true whether you're on the surface of the moon, in the middle of space, or on planet Earth. And this is useful. Geometry is useful in that we can use it to build structures. Right? So you can see this without experiencing it. Now, it helps that Pythagoras was a genius. And he could see this with his mind's eye and figure it out. I'm not sure that I'm that bright. But you can see this with the mind's eye. You can figure this out a priori. So when we're looking at these argument structures, the first thing we have to do is we have to distinguish between valid and invalid. A lot of times, and true and false. A lot of times people confuse these words and they use them interchangeably. They use valid to mean true and invalid to mean false, and they're not the same things. Valid and invalid go to the structure of an argument. True and false deal with whether or not there is a basis in reality for the propositions we put forward. So valid and invalid go to the structure. I can say something and I can make a logical argument that has no basis in reality. If it rains, the streets get wet. It rained, therefore the streets are wet. This is a valid argument. If I said that today, would it be true? If we look outside today, the sky is clear, there's no rain in the forecast, right? So if I said it today, it would be validly structured, not true. So we want both good structures in our arguments, and this is a deductive argument. This is called the modus ponens, the mode of putting, and we want them to have basis in reality. Right? So structure is important. And the rule book gives you other examples of these kinds of arguments. A bad structure of the argument is called denying the antecedents. So this is the antecedent of the statement. If it rains, that's the antecedent. The streets get wet. This is the consequent. It did not rain, therefore the streets are not wet. What's wrong with that? What is wrong with denying the antecedent? Which it did not rain. So this is the antecedent, this is the consequent. What's wrong with denying the antecedent? Yes.
Basically denying your own argument, or
Not necessarily.
There could be,
It's a problem with structure.
there could be other conditions.
There could be other conditions, right? The streets could get wet for a lot of things other than it raining in Oklahoma today. Why else do the streets get wet in Oklahoma? Well,
there's a fire.
we could what?
There was a fire.
There could be a fire and they released a, flood of water to put out the fire and the streets got wet. Why else does it get wet in Oklahoma? Well, we have a tendency to this time of year water our yards because there's a lack of rainfall. And so all these people turn on their watering systems and the water oftentimes runs off the yard and into the street. So there's a variety of other reasons why the street could be wet. All we're saying is that if it rains, the street does get wet, but there may be other reasons for that. So it's overlooking alternatives, which is one of the problems with denying the antecedent. Now, it could be that this is a true statement. It didn't rain and the streets are not wet today. As I was driving in here, the streets were dry and it didn't rain. So that could be true, but the form of the argument is not valid. So we want valid structure and true statements. You have to distinguish between your premise and your conclusion. This is called begging the question. And I've had students tell me this, so this is an example that they give in the book. The Bible is the word of God who wrote it. The Bible says God exists, therefore God exists. Now, I've had students tell me this, like, no, God did not sit down at the cosmic word processor, open up his Google Docs, and produce the Bible. No. No. Right? I mean, like, no, didn't happen. In the words of the Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the Bible is the word of God through the words of man, speaking in the idiom of his time. So God didn't sit down and type it out and give it to Moses on Mount Sinai. The Bible is divinely inspired, but he didn't sit down at the typewriter and pound it out. What's wrong with this argument? Well, it relies upon the conclusion as part of the premise. So distinguishing between your premise and your conclusion. Lots of arguments right now in the political marketplace, for example, about abortion. This is a huge issue. It's going to play a huge issue in the polls and in the political marketplace next fall. In 1973, in a case called Roe versus Wade, the United States Supreme Court legalized abortion. Now, this deals with a marketing issue because prior to 1965, in a case called Griswold versus Connecticut, for example, it was illegal in this country to market, possess, use, or promote the distribution of contraceptive devices. The state of Connecticut had a law against doctors or healthcare physicians promoting, selling, distributing contraceptive devices. In that case, the Supreme Court comes up with this idea of a right to privacy. The right to privacy is found nowhere in the United States Constitution. It is created out of judicial fiat in what the court in William O. Douglas calls the penumbra and emanations of the Constitution. So the penumbra, if you watch a solar eclipse, I don't have a red marker, so I'll use a blue marker for the sun and a black marker for the moon. Now the moon is smaller than the sun, but as you have the eclipse and the moon appears to blot out the sun, you get this shadow figure around, and that's what the court says is the right to privacy. It's this shadowy area using things like the First, the Third, the Fourth, and the Fifth Amendments, the Ninth and 10th Amendments to the Constitution. The court says that there's this idea of privacy. The First Amendment contains 5 substantive rights that are important to marketers because they allow us to sell our goods. So what's in the First Amendment? Well, it contains 5 rights: freedom of speech, press, religion, assembly, and petition of government for redress of grievances. 5 substantive rights that are found in the First Amendment. And those rights have been used in business a lot. For example, in the United States, we can market to children, whereas in other countries they can't, based on this First Amendment freedom that we have. Businesses have a First Amendment right according to the court. Businesses are people. When Mitt Romney was running for president, politicians get in trouble when they say the truth, when they say real things out loud. And one of the members of the press was lamenting something that business had done. And Mitt Romney said, "Businesses are people, my friends." And everybody laughed. But that's true. Businesses are legal people. They have legal rights. Now, they're not actual people, but they are legal entities. They are legal persons. And the Supreme Court has said that this right of First Amendment speech allows them to promote all kinds of things, right? So based on this idea that there's this penumbra, the First Amendment, the Third Amendment, nobody remembers what the Third Amendment is. That's the quartering of soldiers, that no soldiers should be quartered in private homes in times of peace and in times of war only by a manner prescribed by Congress. That, the court says, implies a right to privacy. The Fourth Amendment, the right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures is constituted of a right to privacy according to the court. The Fifth Amendment, you all know what the Fifth Amendment is. It's the one that prevents the police from beating a confession out of you, right? It's the right to not be compelled to be a witness against yourself, to say, I take the Fifth. The Fifth also contains one of two due process clauses in the United States Constitution. The second due process clause is found in the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which makes applicable to the states most of the Bill of Rights. So the court says there's this right to privacy found in the United States Constitution. In Griswold versus Connecticut, the progeny of Griswold is Roe. Now, the Supreme Court has recently overturned Roe versus Wade, and this is going to be a huge political marketing issue next year. Lots of times I see in these political marketing debates, people making bad arguments. They'll just rely on the fact, for example, they'll say, abortion is killing. Abortion is the killing of a human being. A baby is a human. That's an argument that is psychologically appealing, but we have to first step back and we cannot just rely on abortion as murder as the basis of that argument. We have to decide what is a human being, right? First. Now, you can make an argument that says that a member of the species is genetically X. And thus, this is a member of the species. And as a member of the species, this is a logical argument. The unjustified killing is murder. But you can't just rely on saying that it's murder because we say it's murder, right? Murder is defined at the common law as the unlawful killing of a human being with malice aforethought. So you're going to have to define what is a human being. And when does human life begin? And there are good arguments on both sides of that debate, right? And then if we accept that it is a human life, well, does another life have? Because again, at the common law, murder is defined as the unlawful killing of a human being with malice aforethought. Unlawful. Is there a balancing, right? These are tough questions to answer. But it's important that if you're going to make these arguments, that you make them logically and reasonably rather than just relying on passion. It's not that that won't get you somewhere, that these kinds of arguments will not persuade people, but it's not going to be the most persuasive. Right? So we can't rely on the circular reasoning to defend our arguments. We're going to have to distinguish between the premises, which is the evidence that we offer in support of the conclusion that we want to reach. Number 3, present your ideas in a natural order. So if you're making a historical argument, generally speaking, it's chronological. Lots of arguments that we make are historical. Let's take this question, for example. Given the advanced technological, so when I first started teaching, for example, we didn't have the ability to broadcast on something called YouTube. I've done this job since I was 22 years old. That's when I started teaching at the college level. And at that point in time, we had cameras and we had camcorders back in the dark ages, but they were pretty expensive and nobody had the ability to just live stream from their classroom onto YouTube. Now we have this amazing invention and I can broadcast myself. We can all be celebrities. I keep hoping that my YouTube channel will take off and then I'll make millions of dollars. But for some reason, nobody seems to want to, watch videos of college professors lecturing about marketing. I just don't understand that. The videos that I have the most hits on are the ones where I'm doing something that's, I guess, far more useful than marketing. I think this is pretty useful. But for example, I had created a video on how to replace the side mirrors on my Dodge Ram 3500 because they keep getting knocked off. It's a large truck, and for some reason, the mirrors stick out and people just can't help but hit them. You would think they can see them. The truck has big hips, so it's like they're having to swerve around the hips and then hit my mirror. And after having to after taking it to the dealership twice and it being $1,000 to replace this, I thought, well, I can do this myself. So I got out the manuals and figured out how to replace the mirrors. It's actually a pretty easy thing to do. So I made a video on it on YouTube, and that's the video I think that has the most hits on my YouTube channel. All of the videos of my lectures have something like, 2 or 3 hits or something like that as students are studying for exams and they watch it to review something and they, probably not watching it to the end. But hope springs eternal that this will pick up and people will find it interesting. I find it absolutely fascinating what people will watch on YouTube and the ones that have these huge number of hits. Some of it I understand, some of it I don't. I never would have thought that watching videos of people eating food and commenting on it would be popular, but they're horribly popular and they are kind of addictive. I follow some of these ones because my family owns a business in Guthrie and I'm the chef for the business. And so I like to cook and so I like to watch these videos. There's a couple of British guys that I think are pretty funny. Their names are Josh and Ollie, and so together they become Jolly. And they make these videos of them trying all kinds of different foods. The ones with them trying Southern biscuits and gravy is absolutely hysterical because it's these 2 skinny little English guys that are shoving huge amounts of food. I've never seen anybody take these huge bites of food before. And it's just kind of funny, the commentary that they have, but not terribly useful. And it's wildly popular. They have over 1 million subscribers to their channel. I have nowhere near that. But we didn't have this technology available when I started teaching many, many, many years ago. And now I can broadcast to anybody who wants to log on to YouTube and watch this show. Given that technology and the advances, is an understanding of the history of marketing, for example, important today? Or have we gone so far beyond what was capable at the dawn of marketing that it's no longer really important to understand a history? What do you think?
I think it's still important to understand the history because there's parts of it that is still used today, but it is further advancing to where some stuff is becoming irrelevant.
Okay, so you think that some of the principles of what makes, for example, a good ad could be applied to modern technology, but the emphasis on past technologies, for example, the use of heavy reliance on radio might be misguided because we're no longer, how many of you actually listen to the radio in your car anymore? Anybody listen to satellite radio in your car? Nobody even listens to satellite. Why the hell would you even listen to satellite? That was really big, probably 15 years ago, satellite radio came out and it was, you were no longer gonna have the ads. It was sort of like cable television. Cable television, when it came out, it was, you're paying for it, so you don't have the ads. Now, you have cable television and you pay for it and you get the ads. I mean, it's like they're double dipping on the revenue stream. But satellite radio is the same idea, that you wouldn't have, you could listen to the country station and you wouldn't have all these pesky interruptions of people advertising, you know, Lynn Hickey Dodge or Bob Moore Nissan or whatever else it was that they were advertising. And now even on satellite radio, they're advertising stuff. So that was a big deal to move to satellite radio. But why the hell would you even do that now when you've got this device, which automatically connects to your car for most of us, and you can play whatever you want on a playlist through Bluetooth or through Bluetooth. If I can speak today. Why would you even listen to radio? So, you know, how are we going to get this in? I don't know. So maybe there's different principles, but I think that a history of marketing is important because if you don't understand the history, you don't understand how we got to this point. And a lot of the tools that we use for marketing may be new and innovative, but making the appeals fundamentally involves sort of the same things. Figuring out what people want and need and how to do that, and then delivering it in the most effective manner. And to understand that, you have to sort of have an understanding of the history of marketing. So I've made an argument, right? And you've helped me make this argument that a history of the discipline is an important aspect of understanding marketing. So we can present that in historical, chronological order in terms of how we got to where we are today, where I'm able to broadcast on YouTube from when I first started teaching. These were relatively new. When I first started teaching, every room had a chalkboard, and I actually kind of miss chalkboards because students could see my writing on a chalkboard, they could understand it. These are slick, and so I draw things and you can't really see what I'm drawing on there because, you know, my handwriting is absolutely horrible as a result of having gone through both a JD and a PhD program. So of course, historical, a lot of the arguments that we make are not necessarily going to be historical though in marketing because we're going to use more appeals towards things that people want. And so we might think about using a primacy effect in marketing, which is that you put your best argument forward first. This is called the inverted pyramid, and you learn to do this in journalism school. They'll talk about the inverted pyramid, where you put your main idea, your most important point first, because that's the thing that people are going to read. So in a article, in a journalism article for a newspaper or things like that, people are going to read what? Probably the first paragraph, and then the amount of readership drops off after that first. People historically, again, if you went back in time, people actually got the paper and they would read the paper. My grandmother did this she got the morning paper every morning, and she would sit down with a cup of coffee when she was retired and read the paper. They would go through the paper. Now, are they reading the whole thing? The paper used to be a rather thick tome. The Daily Oklahoman was a rather, now it's, I don't know, a paltry 10 pages or something like that. But it used to be this thick thing, and there would be different sections of the paper, particularly on Sunday, and she would read it. Now, did she read everything? No, but she would read the headlines, right? So you're gonna, the president comes to Oklahoma City. Well, you know what it's about, right? It's a political leader that's coming to Oklahoma City. And then as you go through the article, you get more detail, but you put your strongest point first so that people know what it's about. That's going to catch their attention. Or you might want to use the recency effect, which is that people are going to remember the last thing that they heard. We actually did some experiments. I used to have a business where we did some promotional research for various companies. And one of the ones that we did that my colleague and I did was for frozen yogurt. We had a company that hired us to do frozen yogurt surveys. And one of the things that we did as part of that research was we tried out samples on UCO students to see which ones that they preferred. And in order to avoid these effects, we had to switch up the order that we gave samples. And remember, because when you're trying frozen yogurt or ice cream or things like that, people have a tendency to, the first one that they taste is the one that they say that they like the most in many instances, because what? They're not primed for it. And so it's a new experience, but after you've tasted 5 or 6 things of frozen yogurt, guess what? They sort of all run together. You remember the first one, right? So we had to change the order up to make sure that we were getting a valid response. So there's no necessary absolute rule as to whether you do historic, inverted, recency, but it should be in a natural order that meets the needs of the kind of argument that you're making. It should be non-emotive. You should avoid emotionally charged language. Again, my political marketing example about abortion, this is one where everybody is like very emotional about this argument. And it doesn't lead to good arguments. So you have to avoid emotionally charged language that leads people to the cause that you're promoting. Consistency. You should use consistent terms throughout your argument. For example, if you start by saying liberal, don't then switch. People do this because they think that the reader needs variety. And my mother says to me, my mother was a high school English teacher for a short period of time. It's kind of amazing to me that my mother still, how people say things, their perception is off. My mother tells everybody, she's like, well, I was an English teacher. And I'm like, Mom, you were an English teacher for about 5 minutes of your life, and then you decided that it didn't make enough money and you became an entrepreneur. She's owned businesses, started businesses, sold businesses for, 50 years of her life. She was an English teacher for like 3 years, but she still tells everybody, well, I was a high school English teacher. Which is interesting to me because she tells everybody, this is my son, the lawyer. She never says, this is my son, the college professor, because her perception is that being a lawyer is more prestigious than being a college professor. So she tells everybody that I'm a lawyer. And I'm like, I have a PhD in marketing. And she's very proud of the fact that she has 2 sons that are lawyers. My brother's also a lawyer. So both of her children ended up being lawyers. And that's what she tells everybody. And I've been a college professor far longer than I've been a lawyer. I became a college professor before I became a lawyer, and then went to law school. So perception is reality, right? So my mother says to me, the reason I tell you this story is my mother says to me all the time, Grant, your writing is uninspired. And it is, because I'm an academic writer. And so I stick in my writing to consistent terms. People think that they need to vary things up. So if you're talking about the liberal position, for example, people will say, well, the left-leaning or the politically popular. They'll start using different terms, and those actually have different meanings. Politically popular or populism is not necessarily liberal. Populism could be, for example, reactionary and could be completely conservative. You have populists on both sides of the political spectrum. And so you need to stick to one meaning for your argument and stick to consistent terms, use consistent terms and use them consistently. academic writing and academic arguments should not be like a mystery novel that you have to wade through until you get to the end to figure out who did it. And that's what my mother thinks my writing is uninspired, because it's academic. I had a student who wrote on their essay exam, I approached this problem eager as a squirrel in an oak forest. When wham bam, the answer came to me like an elephant in a circus tumbling routine. And I wrote back, I leapt like a gazelle to the conclusion that you deserve an F for forcing me to read this dribble. Right? The way academics write is, I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you. I'm going to tell you, and then I'm going to tell you what I said, right? Thesis statement, consistent terms, substantive examples, conclusion. And there should be this logical connection between these things called a nexus, right? So use consistent terms for your arguments. Stick to one meaning for each term. In my example here, there was a brilliant guy who wrote a book. He had a fake PhD, and the book was entitled, this was very popular about 20 years ago, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. And what he highlighted in that book was that, guess what? Shocker. Men and women think differently about things. Now, whether or not that is biological, I don't know. Could it be that it was socialized? And the premise of his book is that we think differently, and understanding those thinkings, the way we think differently is, again, he was a brilliant marketer. He had a fake PhD. I don't think he had any real academic credentials to make these kinds of claims. And every claim that he made in the book was sort of broad generalizations that, big platitudes. But you can see that arguments like this can be used to start to limit people. Now, again, I don't know if it's biological or sociological or socialization that leads to these differences, but there are some differences in the way we have a tendency to think. I think a lot of it is socialization. I'll give you an example from my own childhood that I just remember thinking was absolutely horrific at the time that I was sitting there. So I grew up with a brother. I actually have other siblings, but they're much older and they're not my mother's children, right? So they're my stepfather's kids from a previous marriage. And so I grew up basically with, one sibling in the house. We were both boys, which meant that we had similar experiences in terms of our parents' expectations of us and the rearing. But my best friend had sisters. He was the only boy, 3 sisters. And I remember being invited over to their house for dinner and to spend the night when I was a kid. And his mother had made this big meal. People actually used to do this. They actually used to cook and eat at home rather than eating DoorDash or Uber Eats or whatever it is that you do. Does anybody in here actually cook? A few of you, okay, all right. People actually used to do this every meal, or at least 2 meals a day. They'd get up and cook breakfast and eat dinner at home, and you ate lunch at school or whatever. But they don't seem to do that very much anymore. That seems to be a rather old-fashioned idea. But his mother actually, it's Friday night, spending the night. They made a meal, and she had made an enormously healthy. I was born and raised in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and this family had moved from Missouri to New Mexico. So they were making what is I think an epitome of a traditional Southern meal. It was Salisbury steak, gravy, and mashed potatoes with green beans that had been boiled to the point that there was probably no nutritional value left in them, along with bacon fat. Right, and that's like a very staple of Southern food. Like boil the hell out of some green beans along with a lot of bacon fat, peeled potatoes, mash them, and serve them with gravy and chicken. I mean, like none of that is what we might consider a heart healthy diet in any way, shape, or form. But his mother said, Monty, that was my best friend, do you want some more mashed potatoes and gravy? And he said, no, I'm fine. And his sister said, well, I'll have some. And what do you think his mother's response was?
You don't need any.
You don't need any more. You'll get fat. Right? That's like I was sitting there like my jaw fell slack. But that's a difference in the way we socialize in many instances, men and women. So this guy notices in this book, that there are differences between men and women. Well, if you use that, for example, to justify inequality, that can be problematic. If I take, for example, a male who is somewhat in terms of physical stature similar to a female, and I send them both off to the gym to lift weights and engage in a program of aerobic and anaerobic exercise, which of those individuals is going to put on muscle mass faster than the other? The male, probably. Which is going to lose weight faster? The male is probably going to lose weight faster, right? I mean, they just burn more calories. I mean, all things being equal. So that's not equal. And I see people make this argument all the time, like men and women are not equal and therefore the law should not pretend that they are. Equality before the law is something different, though, than equality of strength or equality of athletic prowess, isn't it? When I was going through college, this was a huge debate in terms of whether or not we should allow and whether or not the 14th Amendment and the Equal Protection Clause. So there's two due process clauses in the United States Constitution. The first due process clause is found in the Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution, which also provides for prohibition against being forced to be a witness against yourself or self-incrimination. The second due process clause is found in the 14th Amendment, and that contains the only equal protection clause in the document. So the Equal Protection Clause was passed after the Civil War. We get three amendments to the United States Constitution, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendment. The 13th Amendment basically abolishes slavery. The 14th Amendment provides for due process and equal protection of the law for freedmen and everybody else. And the 15th Amendment grants them the right, freedmen, the right to vote. So the right to vote cannot be predicated on color or previous servitude, right? Women don't get the right to vote, by the way, until the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution. So we have a whole lot of inequality that's gone on throughout the history of the United States. And the Equal Protection Clause is meant to eliminate that. Equality before the law is not the same thing as equality of skill or equality of ability or equality of strength. What is equality before the law? You're using the term equal in a sense that is ill-defined when you do this. If you make these kinds of arguments like men and women are not the same and the law shouldn't pretend that they are. Equality before the law is to say that we should not judge you based on your gender, your race, your creed, your color. We should judge, if we're accusing you of a crime like murder, based on objective facts. And we should weigh those facts equally, whether or not you are a male, a female, you know, your ethnicity is Hispanic, non-Hispanic, you know, et cetera, et cetera. I guess I'm out of time. If you got ducks, and also if you went to the carnival, come up and let me know and I'll give you, points and I will mark where we are. I've got 1 minute
My name on it.
Yeah, no proof of it.